Most people don't understand what real loneliness feels like until the snow starts talking back. That was the thought running through Grace Miller's mind on the night everything began, a night so quiet, so brutally cold, that even the trees seemed to be holding their breath. Deep in the birch woods of Vermont, inside a tiny cabin tucked between two slopes of frozen land, Grace lived a life most people would have mistaken for exile. But to her, solitude had long ago stopped feeling like punishment. It was survival. It was the only thing she could trust. The cabin was older than she was, and the wood creaked whenever the wind pushed too hard. But Grace didn't mind. The stillness soothed something in her, a wound carved by years of chaos she rarely spoke about. She moved through the small living space with quiet precision, folding blankets, stacking firewood, checking the latch on the window, the simple rituals that built the shape of her days. She was 26, but sometimes her eyes made her look older, as if she had lived 2 or 3 lives already. Outside, the first heavy snow of December was falling, thick enough to blur the world into white. Snowflakes clung to the glass as if begging to be let in, but Grace only watched them with a muted sense of calm. Winter didn't frighten her. What frightened her were memories those she couldn't lock out, no matter how many hours she spent repairing broken floorboards or learning the rhythm of the forest. Sometimes, when the nights were long, she remembered herself at 15, standing barefoot on the sticky linoleum of a rundown apartment in Burlington. The air reeked of cheap vodka and burnt toast. Her mother lay passed out on a sagging couch, lipstick smeared, cigarette burns polka-dotting the armrest. Grace remembered the trembling of her younger brother Noah's hand as he tried to wake their mother, and the way little Sophie cried whenever the shouting started. Grace had been the one to braid Sophie's hair, pack their lunches, hide them in her room when strangers visited. She had been the parent long before she understood what motherhood meant, and she remembered most of all the night. The sirens came. Blue and red lights spilled across the peeling wallpaper. Neighbors crowded the hall. A social worker spoke in a voice too soft to rehearsed. They zipped her mother into a black bag before Grace could even say goodbye. And then, within hours, with rain still clinging to her hair, Grace watched her siblings being driven away in 2 separate cars. No amount of screaming or begging could change the rules of the system. She was just 15, too young to keep a family together, too old to belong anywhere. Those memories were scars. They throbbed whenever she thought too long about them. So, she didn't. She kept moving. She worked, she saved, and the day the state legally declared her an adult and released her with a plastic bag of belongings, she stepped onto a Greyhound bus and didn't look back. A memory of her old neighbor, Martha Ellis, guided her here. This forgotten cabin she once mentioned, abandoned after its elderly owner passed away. Grace walked 6 miles through snow to find it, her shoes soaked, her breath burning in her chest. When she discovered the key under the mat, she knew she had reached the end of something, and maybe the beginning of something else. The cabin became her sanctuary. She patched its roof, fixed its windows, and found a part-time job at a small grocery store in town. She lived simply: coffee in the morning, firewood in the afternoon, silence at night, and though she still carried the ache of losing Noah and Sophie, the forest at least let her breathe. On the night everything changed. Grace had just finished mending a rip in her coat when she heard a sound she didn't expect in a storm like this: a metallic scraping, followed by a dull, rhythmic thud. At first, she thought the wind was playing tricks, but the sound came again, closer this time, carried through the storm like a faint plea for help. Grace wrapped her scarf around her neck, grabbed the old lantern she kept by the door, and stepped outside. The cold slapped her instantly, sharp enough to sting her cheeks, but she pushed forward, boots sinking deep into the rising drifts. The birch trees swayed violently, their branches whipping against the sky as if warning her to turn back. But Grace knew the sound of distress. She had lived through enough of it to recognize it anywhere. The beam of her lantern caught the shape of a car, a dark sedan lodged crookedly in a mound of snow near the edge of the woods. Its headlights flickered, faint and dying. Grace's heart kicked against her ribs. She trudged toward the driver's side door, wiping away the snow crusting the window. Inside sat an elderly man, slumped over the steering wheel, his skin pale gray, his lips tinged blue. One of the windows had cracked open under the weight of the wind, letting snow drift across his lap. His fingers twitched once, weakly, as if fighting to hold onto the last threads of consciousness. Grace shouted over the howl of the storm, "Sir, can you hear me?" He didn't answer. Her hands shook as she yanked the door open. The cold air swallowed them both, but she reached in, gripping his coat, feeling the alarming chill of his body. He was alive but barely. Grace fumbled for her phone, dialing 911 with numb fingers. The dispatcher's voice tried to stay calm, but the urgency was clear. Keep him warm. Stay with him. Help is on the way. She pressed her body against his, trying to share heat, her breath shaking as she whispered, "Stay with me. Just stay awake." Snow lashed her face, and for a moment, she felt the old fear rising, that helpless panic she once felt when she couldn't save the people she loved. She refused to feel it again by the time the paramedics arrived. Grace was trembling so hard she could barely stand. They lifted the man to Thomas Hale. According to the ID they found onto a stretcher. One paramedic glanced at her and said, "You probably saved his life." Grace wasn't sure how to respond. She just nodded, watching as the ambulance disappeared into the swirling snow. The hospital was small, quiet, and cold in a different way. Grace sat outside Thomas's room for hours, wrapped in a thin blanket, listening to monitors beeping behind the glass. When a nurse finally approached, her expression softened. "No family listed," she said. "No visitors on record. He came in alone." Grace felt a strange heaviness settle in her chest. She understood what it meant to be alone, and without either of them knowing it yet. This quiet beginning, this night of snow and silence, was the start of something that would change everything. For days after the snowstorm, Grace found herself replaying the moment she pulled Thomas Hale out of that frozen car. Something about it had shaken her in a way she couldn't quite name, maybe because saving him felt like saving a part of herself she thought was long gone. And in the quiet halls of the county hospital, as winter pressed hard against the windows, her life began to shift in a direction she never expected. Thomas recovered slowly, his breath steadied, the color returned to his cheeks, and though his voice remained thin, his eyes grew sharper each time Grace walked into the room. Nurses whispered that he perked up whenever she arrived. But the day he was cleared for discharge, everything changed again. He refused the rehab facility that the doctor recommended. His words were soft but firm. "I don't want to die surrounded by machines and strangers. If you'll allow it, I'd rather stay somewhere warmer than that place." Grace blinked. "You mean my cabin?" Thomas nodded. "You saved my life. Being near you reminds me that something in this world can still be decent." It wasn't an easy decision. She knew what it meant to care for someone, especially someone as fragile as him. But kindness was the one thing she never unlearned, no matter how much the world took from her. So she agreed. The cabin shifted from solitary refuge to quiet partnership. Grace set up a small cot beside the window for Thomas, where the morning light fell in soft golden lines. She cooked simple meals, soup, soft bread, herbal tea, and helped him dress, walk, breathe easier. At night, she read to him from books she found at the thrift store. He listened with his eyes closed, as if every word soothed something bruised and hidden. In return, Thomas shared pieces of his past, not in dramatic confessions, but in small truths spoken at odd hours. "My wife loved success more than she ever loved me," he said one evening. "After our son died, she never looked at me the same, as if grief was something that made me inconvenient." Grace didn't pry. She simply sat with him, letting the fire crackle between them. They lived that way to lonely hearts, finding comfort not through words, but through the simple fact of not being alone. And then Olivia arrived. Grace heard the engine before she saw the car, a polished black SUV crunching through the snow with an authority that didn't belong in the quiet woods. When the door opened, a woman stepped out wearing a fur-lined coat and heels that sank into the snow with every step. Cold wind whipped her blonde hair away from her perfectly made face as she surveyed the cabin like it offended her. Grace opened the door before Olivia could knock. "Can I help you?" she asked quietly. Olivia slid her sunglasses off, revealing eyes sharp enough to cut through glass. "Yes, you can tell me what the hell you're doing with my husband." Grace stiffened. "Your husband?" The woman brushed past her without waiting for permission, heels clicking on the old wooden floor. She stopped when she saw Thomas sitting in the armchair by the window, wrapped in Grace's gray wool blanket. "Thomas?" Her voice wavered between shock and accusation. "You're alive." He managed a tired smile. "Olivia," she turned back to Grace, her expression narrowing with disdain. "I'm assuming you're the one who found him. I see you've made yourself very comfortable here." Grace opened her mouth to explain, but Olivia cut her off with a scoff. "Please, I've seen this before. Lonely old man, young girl with a tragic past, a cabin in the woods. It's practically a cliché." Thomas tried to speak. "She saved my life." Olivia ignored him completely. "You must think you're incredibly clever, cozying up to a man who's one stroke away from leaving behind whatever scraps he has left. Tell me, do you always choose men who can be rewritten into your little hero story?" Grace felt her cheeks burn, but she held her voice steady. "You're mistaken. I'm not taking anything from him." Olivia stepped closer, the scent of expensive perfume filling the room. Then why is he here? Why is he with you? Thomas's voice cracked. Because you weren't. For a moment, Olivia's mask slipped. Her mouth tightened, her eyes glimmering with something that might have been guilt, but only for a heartbeat. Then the coldness returned. This isn't over, she said as she stomped toward the door. You've made a very poor choice, Miss Miller. When she drove away, the silence left behind felt heavier than any storm, but Olivia didn't stay gone. 2 days later, Grace heard the SUV again, this time accompanied by another engine. She stepped outside to find Olivia standing beside a sheriff's deputy, her arms crossed, a small velvet pouch dangling from her hand. There she is, Olivia said with venom. The thief. Grace's breath caught. What are you talking about? Olivia loosened the pouch, letting a platinum bracelet with emeralds catch the light. This was missing from my home in Boston. Imagine my surprise when I saw similar pieces in my husband's things here. The deputy cleared his throat. Ma'am, we just need to ask a few questions. You can search the cabin, Grace said calmly, though her heart hammered in her chest. And they did. Drawers, cabinets, under the mattress, behind the stove. Every inch of Grace's home was overturned. Thomas watched helplessly from his chair, his hands trembling too much to lift. When the search ended, the deputy removed his hat. Nothing here, he said softly. Miss Miller, I'm sorry for the trouble. Olivia's face twisted, desperate to maintain the image of righteous anger. This isn't finished, she hissed. I always get to the truth. Grace didn't answer. She simply stood still, letting the cold wind wash over her, letting the humiliation settle like dust she refused to choke on. But when she turned back toward the cabin, the ache in her chest felt sharper than any winter air. Thomas waited for her by the table, his eyes wet with something like shame. She's always needed someone to blame, he whispered. I never wanted you to be caught in the crossfire of my past. Grace shook her head gently. You're not the problem, Thomas. He reached into the drawer with a trembling hand and pulled out a thin stack of papers. His voice trembled as he pushed them toward her. Is my way of making sure no one can hurt you because of me. It was a deed transfer, and a small bank letter. The cabin and the savings he had left were now in her name. Grace stared at him, stunned. Thomas, I can't accept this. You don't owe me anything. He gave a weak, tired smile. You already gave me more than anyone has in a long time. Let me do this while I still can. The fire crackled softly. Snow drifted outside the window, and in that quiet moment, Grace realized that the piece she had built here wasn't just hers anymore. It was something they had created together, and it would be the very thing someone else tried to destroy. The night Thomas passed away was strangely calm. Outside the cabin, the wind that had roared for days softened into a hush, as if the world itself was pausing to listen. Grace had checked on him countless times, sensing a shift in his breathing, a slow fade of the strength he once fought to keep. Near midnight, she sat beside him, a book open in her lap even though she wasn't reading. The fire crackled low, throwing shadows that danced across the wooden walls. Thomas was barely awake, but when he opened his eyes, the faintest smile touched his lips. You gave me a home again, he whispered, voice thin as paper. You already had one, Grace replied softly. You just forgot where it was. He let out a short, fragile breath, almost a laugh. Thank you for letting me remember. Those were his last words. His hand relaxed in hers. His chest lifted once more, then settled. Grace didn't cry immediately. She simply closed her eyes and held his hand for a long, quiet moment, letting the stillness wrap around them like a blanket. When she finally stood, she covered him carefully, the way she imagined someone would have wanted him to be cared for in the morning. The sheriff came to take the report, and the nurse from town arrived to confirm the time. They spoke gently, respectfully. They all knew how much she had done for him. And yet, when the cabin fell silent again, the absence of Thomas filled the air like a cold draft that refused to leave. Grace mourned in the only way she knew, quietly, methodically. She cleaned the dishes. She folded his blanket. She left his slippers by the window, unable to move them just yet. And for 2 weeks, she didn't hear a single car on the road leading to her cabin, until one afternoon when a black SUV rolled up behind a silver sedan. This time, Olivia didn't step out loudly or angrily. She emerged with an unsettling calm, dressed in a sleek coat, a leather folder tucked under her arm. Beside her stood a tall man in a tailored suit, her attorney. His expression was polite, but distant enough to make Grace's stomach tighten. Miss Miller, Olivia greeted, her tone smooth as glass. We need to talk. Grace didn't invite them in. She stood at the door, arms folded loosely, forcing her breath to remain steady. Olivia's lawyer spoke first. We're here regarding the estate of Thomas Hale. Mrs. Hale informs us that shortly before his death, he transferred property and financial assets to you. These actions raise significant concerns about undue influence. Grace felt the words strike her like cold rain, but her face stayed calm. Olivia continued, voice sharpening. You manipulated a vulnerable, sick old man. You pushed him to sign away everything while he was confused and dependent. That isn't true, Grace said quietly. Her calmness irritated Olivia. It doesn't matter what you think is true. The courts will decide, and they did. Within a week, Grace found herself pulled into a legal storm she never imagined. Court summons, mandatory hearings, investigators knocking on her door, rumors circulating in the nearby towns, whispers of a young woman stealing from a dying man. Even the grocery store where she worked part-time seemed colder, as if people were waiting for proof she wasn't who they thought she was. Her name became a question mark, but Grace remained silent, not weak, not defeated, just silent. She answered only what she was required to answer. She didn't argue with Olivia's accusations. She didn't defend herself in front of strangers eager for gossip. When Olivia pointed at her across the courtroom, calling her a parasite dressed as a savior, Grace simply looked forward, hands folded, eyes steady. Her silence unsettled the room more than any outburst could have. The legal process dragged on. Olivia insisted Thomas had been mentally compromised, incapable of making decisions. She painted a picture of a greedy young woman who preyed on an old man's loneliness. She brought in friends, distant relatives, even a financial advisor who hadn't spoken to Thomas in years. But Grace didn't break. Her attorney, assigned through a pro bono program, spoke for her, presenting documents, dates, medical records. Yet no matter how brutal the accusations became, Grace never raised her voice, never cried in front of Olivia, never let anger surface, and it was that restraint that ultimately cracked Olivia's case. On the third hearing, when Olivia appeared certain she had cornered Grace, Thomas's longtime lawyer, Mr. Addison, entered the courtroom. A man with a calm presence and decades of experience. He carried a small sealed envelope. Your Honor, he said, I was instructed by Mr. Hale to present this only if his estate was challenged. The judge nodded. Please proceed. Mr. Addison opened the envelope and produced a supplemental will dated, notarized, witnessed. The documents clearly stated that Thomas, fully aware and mentally competent, had chosen to leave the cabin and his remaining savings to Grace Miller in gratitude for her kindness, integrity, and companionship. A quiet ripple moved through the courtroom. Mr. Addison continued. I spoke with Mr. Hale personally. He was neither coerced nor manipulated. He made this decision with absolute clarity. And then the doctor from the county hospital testified. Mr. Hale was lucid during his recovery, she said firmly. He expressed deep trust and affection for Miss Miller. In my professional opinion, he was perfectly capable of making decisions. For the first time, Olivia's confidence faltered. Her chin trembled. Her attorney shifted uneasily, sensing the case slipping from his hands. The judge took a long moment before speaking. There is no evidence of wrongdoing by Miss Miller. On the contrary, the documentation shows full consent and intention from Mr. Hale. The court rules entirely in her favor. The gavel struck, a sound that felt like the ending of a war Grace had never wanted. Olivia stood frozen, color draining from her face. She looked at Grace expecting anger, victory, something to validate her resentment. But Grace only watched her with a quiet, unreadable expression. No triumph, no hatred, just a stillness carved from years of surviving things much worse. That silence, calm, unwavering, untouched by Olivia's fury, was the deepest humiliation of all. That when Olivia turned and walked out of the courtroom, she didn't look back. Her heels clicked sharply across the polished floor, fading with every step until they disappeared entirely. Grace remained seated for a long moment, letting her breath settle. The storm had passed. Not loudly, not dramatically, but just quietly, like the snow that had changed everything, and in that quiet, Grace reclaimed her life. Spring came late to Vermont that year. After months of snow piling against the cabin walls like folded memories, the thaw finally began. Slow drips from the roof, patches of brown earth peeking through the white, thin sunlight warming the frostbitten window panes. Grace felt each change as if the world outside were mirroring something inside her. The trial was behind her. Thomas was gone, but not forgotten. And for the first time in years, she felt the slightest pull toward rebuilding, not just surviving. The money Thomas had left her wasn't much, not enough to change her life entirely, but enough to make it steadier, enough to let her breathe. With it, she repaired the sagging porch, patched the cracked stone around the fireplace, replaced the old rattling windows with ones that opened smoothly. She scrubbed years of soot from the walls, sanded the wooden floors, and repainted the kitchen a soft, warm cream that made morning light look gentler. The biggest change came when she cleared the shed near the tree. She spent weeks turning it into a tiny general store. Grace's goods stocked with handmade candles, knitted scarves, trail snacks, and essentials for hikers passing through. It wasn't grand, but locals liked the charm of it. Travelers enjoyed the friendly quiet, and Grace found a kind of peace standing behind the wooden counter, greeting strangers, offering warmth in simple ways. People in town began to know her name, not as the woman who was dragged into legal chaos, not as the mysterious girl living alone in the woods, but as Grace, the soft-spoken owner of the forest shop who brewed coffee for anyone who arrived cold and tired. The same neighbors who once whispered about her now waved from their cars, stopped in to chat, or dropped off homemade goods for her to sell. For once, the world wasn't taking from her, it was giving back. One afternoon, while sorting a shipment of maple candies, Grace heard the mailman's truck crunch across the gravel. He handed her a stack of letters, mostly local notices and catalogs. But one envelope stood out, immediately white, official, stamped with the seal of the Vermont Department of Social Services. For a moment, she froze. Letters like that had shaped her entire childhood. Placements, relocations, warnings, separations. She had once feared envelopes like this more than thunderstorms. But now, years later, she held it with steady hands. When she finally opened it, a single sheet of paper slipped out. Her heart began to race. Even before she read the words, "We are writing to inform you that your sibling, Noah Miller, has been located." Grace sank into a chair, the paper trembling between her fingers. "He is 22, currently residing in a transitional housing center in New Hampshire. Upon reviewing sealed records and cross-state requests, we confirmed your biological relationship. He has expressed interest in reconnecting with you." The words blurred, not from confusion, from tears. Noah, the boy she protected, the boy she braided hair for, taught to tie shoes, held during storms, the boy ripped from her life in the back seat of a social worker's car. He was alive, and he wanted to find her. The letter included a phone number, a meeting option, and a line she read again and again. "He remembers you." Grace pressed the letter to her chest, shaking with a grief that tasted almost sweet. She didn't realize she'd been crying until she felt the warmth of her tears on her hands. Later that evening, after pacing for nearly an hour, she called. The phone rang once, twice. "Hello." His voice was deeper now, older, but still unmistakably Noah. Her breath hitched. "Noah, it's me. It's Grace." He didn't speak at first. She wondered if he didn't remember after all. Then, in a voice breaking like thin ice, he whispered, "I knew you'd find me. I always knew." The reunion happened 1 week later. Noah arrived on a chilly morning, standing awkwardly on the cabin porch, hands stuffed into the pockets of an oversized coat. He looked different, older, tired around the eyes, a young man shaped by a life as broken as hers. But when he lifted his gaze, the years fell away. There was the boy she once held while the world collapsed behind them. "Grace," he murmured, and she pulled him into her arms before he finished saying her name. They cried quietly, fiercely, with a relief so sharp it felt like healing and hurting at once. When they finally stepped back, Noah laughed through his tears. "This place," he said, glancing around. "It looks like you." Grace smiled. "It's home, and it's yours too, if you want it." He hesitated only a moment before nodding. "I'm tired of leaving everywhere. I want to stay." And he did. They spent the following weeks repairing the cabin together, Noah lifting heavy beams, Grace teaching him how to split logs properly. They ate dinners by the fire, talked about their years apart, mourned Sophie quietly, and rebuilt their bond with every shared story, every silence that didn't feel empty anymore. One morning, Grace wrote a letter to Dr. Avery, the physician who had testified for her during the trial. She thanked her for not only telling the truth, but for doing it with compassion. She added that she planned to enroll in a nursing assistant program in the fall. "I want to help people the way you helped me," she wrote, not out of obligation but out of gratitude. With Noah beside her, and a future that finally felt possible, she mailed the letter with steady hands. As summer approached, the cabin transformed again. Curtains fluttered in warm breezes. The shop grew busier. Noah built a picnic table under the birch trees. Grace planted herbs along the windowsill. Life didn't feel fragile anymore. It felt earned. One evening, just as the sun sank behind the hills, Grace stood by the window, the same place she had stood on countless nights filled with loneliness and fear. But now, the view looked different, warmer, fuller. The cabin hummed with life. Noah's laughter drifted from outside. The world felt less like a storm she had to survive and more like a place she finally belonged. She touched the window frame gently, remembering the girl she once was, the girl who believed she had no control over anything, not even her own story. But she did. She had chosen kindness when bitterness was easier. She had chosen truth when lies threatened to drown her. She had chosen to keep her heart open, even when the world tried to shut it, and now, she had chosen her ending, or rather, her beginning. Outside, fireflies blinked on and off like slow, patient stars. Grace closed her eyes, breathing in the scent of pine and summer air, the quiet promise of tomorrow settling softly around her somewhere deep inside. A truth rose like dawn breaking after a long storm. You don't get to choose where your story starts, but you can choose where it goes, and you can choose how it ends. Grace opened her eyes, smiling at the fading light. For the first time in her life, she wasn't alone, she was home.